Welcome to the Dog Trainers Podcast, a podcast created by dog trainers for dog trainers or anyone who's ever fallen in love with man's best friend.
Episode 8, Which Training Collar is Best? Hey guys, welcome back to the Dog Trainers Podcast. My name's Mariano, that's Brent. Now, here's a question that we get a lot online. What dog training collar is the best? And it's something that it's not exactly a simple answer because there's so many different training collars out there, and there are so many for a reason because, of course, dogs have various different issues that people want to work on. Owners themselves can be different. Approaches can be different. There's so many different nuances to training that we want to make sure that we break down maybe a few of the major ones, when and how they'd be appropriate, and then maybe give you some feedback with that. So let's dive right in. Where did you want to start?
Okay. I guess let's go ahead and start off first. Like, what is a training collar, right? Because there's so many different types of collars. There's like, decorative collars that people can buy. There's, different types of face harnesses and all this different things. What we're just talking about specifically in this particular episode is training collars. So the way I define training collars is very simple. Training collars are usually things that go around the dog's neck that constrict if the dog pulls and relaxes if the dog stops pulling, right? So we call this the collar is a live collar, meaning it constricts and it loosens with the movement of the dog. And so there's a bunch of them. You guys may have seen these, may not know what they're called, but let's go ahead and list them real quick. If we were to start at some of the very, very basic, we have an English slip lead, right? So this is usually a piece of rope that has a loop at the very end and has a piece of leather as a stopper, and that's a slip lead. The cousin of the slip lead is the slip collar, which is just the rope part that goes around the dog's neck. Then we have the cousin of that, which is the choke chain, right? Which is just a slip chain that goes around the dog's neck. A lot of people are very familiar with that because a lot of dogs, that used to be the training collar of choice about 20 years ago. Then we have the martingale, right? The martingale was designed for greyhounds or dogs with very slender necks, right? So if you guys have seen a greyhound before, their neck and their head is closely to the same width. So usually putting on a different collar on them that didn't constrict with them, it was very easy for those dogs to slip out of those collars. And then as we start going further and further into different types of training collars, then we start running into like prong collars. And then we can keep going and look at remote collars, right? Or what people refer to as e-collars. And I think, did I miss any collars? Can you think of?
Not really. I mean, Star Mark collar, the plastic.
Yes, Star Mark or plastic prongs, and they're all kind of similar variations of each other. But pretty much the whole thing that they have in common, with exception to the e-collar, is that they tighten and release with the dog's movement. So that's what we constitute as a training collar.
Yeah, I want to point out just in the very beginning of this whole thing, because when we talk about, let us be clear in this answer, and I hope that people can go into this podcast already kind of expecting or at least understanding this. It's not really going to be possible for us to say this one training collar is the best. We have maybe our personal favorites, or we have favorites for particular types of dogs / owner combos. But what we can, I think, agree to up front is the idea behind a training collar. That's a good thing to bring up, because the difference between a training collar and a collar is training collars are designed with something in mind, and that's to be able to very accurately mark certain moments in time. There's a reason why the collars constrict. Even if we look at something like the more entry-level stuff, like you talked about the English slip lead. So why that versus a regular collar? So if you have a dog on a regular collar, it's possible that the dog can pull, and the collar, because it doesn't constrict in any way, just continues to be kind of applying downward pressure to the bottom of the dog's throat as they pull themselves down the street. Whereas an English slip lead tightens altogether. So that pressure underneath the dog's neck is sort of more dispersed all around.
Right.
Now, that could lead to a little more of a safe situation if everything else is equal and the dog is pulling on this versus this. But when we talk about actual training, if you wanted to start marking that behavior with, let's say, a leash pop, the dog would have a little more of a clearer understanding with the slip lead versus the regular collar, because the slip lead, because it contracts, is more of a precise grab, mentally speaking.
Right.
And the other collars are meant to do that exact same thing.
Right. And one thing that we see that training collars have a benefit over normal house collars or decorative collars, because they constrict, they interrupt what's known as the dog's natural oppositional response. Right. So the natural oppositional response, like if you guys have ever had experience walking a dog on a normal collar, you're going to see that the dog pulls, and for some reason, it seems the more you pull back, the stronger the dog gets. Right. And this is one of the things that we see happen with just normal collars. And so the oppositional response is very simple. It's the more, if you feel something holding you back, our natural response to that is going to be to pull away from it or to fight the oppositional force, right? And so this is normal. One of the big reasons dogs pull is usually because we're pulling them back, right? And it's kind of this chicken or egg thing. We increase pulling by pulling back. And what training collars allow us to do, they allow us to grab the dog's attention and bring them to be present in consciousness, right? So for example, dog pulls against a slip lead, that slip lead tightens up around the dog's neck. All of a sudden the dog goes, what is this around my neck? And it brings their focus to the present moment of what they might be doing. Now, this is not to say that dogs can't choke themselves on choke chains, martingales, things like that. It's going to be a lot easier for us to communicate to the dog, hey, stop focusing on that in front of you and be very present with us here in the moment. Now, I just want to just follow up that statement by saying, every training collar has a technique that follows with it, right? So the way I use a pinch collar is going to be very different than the way I use a slip lead, and the way I use a choke chain is going to be very different than, let's say, the way I use an e-collar or a star mark, right? So there are techniques, and again, remember, these things are tools. The tools by themselves, if misused and mishandled by any practitioner or dog owner or novice dog trainer, it can be bad if the person doesn't know how to use it efficiently. And sometimes we see that the wrong collar is put on the dog, and that's probably why it's being used inefficiently, right?
Yeah, 100%. I've seen that quite a few times where we have a dog who, comes in for training with one collar on, and we talk about a different type of collar and why it may be beneficial. And
Right.
there absolutely is certain techniques that people should know when working with a certain type of collar, because they are different. Even if the collars
Right.
seem really similar, like a star mark to a prong collar or a slip lead to a choke chain, or
Mm-hmm.
um, but two, I think a lot of it just kind of boils down to the dog and where they are. I've met a lot of dogs who, you know, let's say that they, obedience wise, learned perfectly well on like a prong collar and they look sharp and everything. But in
Mm-hmm.
terms of excitement levels, like the, dogs that are reactive toward a skateboard or something like that, sometimes these dogs can be more receptive to, let's say, an e-collar over the prong collar or vice versa,
Mm-hmm.
or, um, and so it's not necessarily our wish to try to push you in one direction or another. I think the best advice that we can give anybody, and the most responsible advice that we can give to anybody would be, do your research, try things out, of course, safely and appropriately. Any tool, I don't care how, which tool, any tool used inappropriately can be dangerous. So don't get scared of
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
horror stories online of this color or that color. Um, Make sure that you buy quality stuff, because that's a risk factor too that you can
That's
easily sidestep.
huge.
And if it's pricey, like I know decent e-collars can be pricey, but it's cheaper than a vet visit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um,
True.
and with that being said, look into it, consider trying it out if it's something that you think you can see yourself doing, because if you're not consistent, you're just wasting your time and money. Um, and if it is something that you can see yourself trying, go for it. And if the dog responds better than something else, be open to the possibility. Be open to the possibility that your dog likes it better for whatever the reason. And we can get into them in a little more detail in a bit. I just wanted to make sure that we prefaced, this idea along with the idea of timing and how these things are supposed to work, so that as people listen to this, they can kind of navigate this with a little easier time.
Yeah. One thing I want to also make clear, because there are so many other devices. I mean, mostly the biggest the biggest issue people have with training collars or anything that goes around the dog's neck is obviously the fear of the dog choking themselves, hurting themselves on their necks. right? So concept, things like weakened tracheas and, all that stuff. Those are real things. I just want to say that. However, I've noticed that dogs who do have, weak tracheas, obviously the dog can have a genetic weak throat. But there are dogs who have, damaged tracheas because I guarantee consistently through that puppy's childhood, they grew up pulling on something before the training collar was even introduced, right? So many times I'll hear people say, my vet said I shouldn't put the dog on a collar because he has a weak trachea. Well, this is even kind of more of a reason for you guys to start dogs on training collars when they're a little bit younger. I would say maybe 6-7 months, because they're getting bigger, they're getting stronger, and you don't want that dog to have many, many months, maybe even a years of pulling and hurting and straining their neck muscles and their trachea, because they are delicate and you can hurt the dog. And that's why it's really important to know what the right collars are to help shape and develop certain behaviors. And then the most important behavior is walking properly on a leash.
Right.
Thank you for listening to the Dog Trainers Podcast, a podcast created by dog trainers for dog trainers, or anyone who's ever fallen in love with man's best friend.
See you next time.